Hi, welcome back to my tutorial. Today in this video we are going to discuss briefly about abstract factory design pattern. By its name, it is considered another layer of abstraction over a factory method design pattern. If you are not familiar with a factory method design pattern, you can just click on the code above or you can just click on the link in the description where I have covered briefly about factory method design pattern. So without any further ado, just get into the video. Let us start with the agenda that what we are going to cover in this video. We are going to talk about what is abstract factory design pattern, advantages and disadvantage of using abstract factory design pattern, diagrammatic explanation about the abstract factory design pattern, and finally we will go for the coding example. What is abstract factory design pattern? It comes under the creational design pattern, which is basically used for creating an object. The abstract factory design pattern is much more similar to the factory method design pattern, but it is considered another layer of abstraction over it. The pattern works around the superfactory that creates the other factories. That's why it is known as a factory of factories. By definition, abstract factory design pattern provides an interface for create the families of related or dependent objects without providing the concrete classes. The good example of this pattern in Java is document builder. So what are all the advantage of using this pattern? The abstract factory design pattern isolates the client code from concrete classes, that is, a implementation of the classes. It promotes a consistency among the objects. And what are all the disadvantages of using this pattern? The first comes the complexity. If there are many related families of related objects that needs to be created, the pattern can add the complexity to the code. The next is readability. Due to the level of abstraction it introduced, the pattern reduces the code readability. The next is maintenance. The pattern can make the code harder to understand, maintain, and debug. And number of classes. The pattern increases the number of classes required for the code. Before going to the diagrammatic explanation about the abstract factory design pattern, let us have some brush up about the factory method design pattern. In factory method design pattern, the client is going to post his requirement to the factory and the factory is responsible to create one among the concrete classes based on the client request. This is actually a brush up about the factory method design pattern. Let me explain the abstract factory design pattern in a diagram. Think like a client is managing your online business. In this case, that is an e-commerce website. The website is developed by using the HTML and CSS for the front end, and for the back end and for the business logic, it can either use a Java or a Python, and for the data saving, it can either use any kind of the database. Suppose a client is planning to do some changes in his application. He is going to call the manager and he is going to tell his all the requirements to the manager. The manager is responsible to pick up the corresponding developer. That can either be the front end developer or a back end developer. The front-end developer are the HTML developers and CSS developer, which is responsible to do some UI changes. Where the back-end developer or the Java or Python developer for the business logic and for the CRUD operation in a database, it is the SQL developer. Suppose a client is planning to add some content in his website. He is going to post the queries to the manager, and the manager is going to call the corresponding developer. That is, in this case, that is a front-end developer, where he is going to call the HTML developer to add the content in the website. And suppose a client is going to have some changes in his UI and he is planning to have some kind of the designing work to be taken care in the website, he is going to request to the manager, and the manager is going to call the front end developer, and in this case he is going to align that to the CSS developer where the designing part is going to taken care in the website. Suppose a client is planning to do some changes in his business logic, he just posts that to the manager. The manager is responsible to pick up the corresponding developer. In this case, that is a backend developer, where it is aligned to the Java or Python developer to take care of the business logic. Suppose a client is planning to do some changes in the data in the database, he is just going to post his query to the manager, and the manager is responsible to pick up the corresponding developer. In this case, that is a backend developer. Now it is going to align to the SQL developer, where the CRUD operation it is going to take care. So this is a real-time example of the abstract factory design pattern. Now, as per the definition, the manager is a super factory which is going to manage the two different factory that has the same interface called the developer interface. Where the front-end developer is one factory and back-end developer is another factory, which shares a related object. Here, the HTML and CSS are the related object which shares the same interface called the UI interface. For the back-end developer factory, Java and Python and SQL developer are two related objects which shares the same interface called the backend interface, where HTML, CSS, Java, and SQL developer are the concrete classes here. So whenever the client is going to request, he is going to request to the super factory. The super factory is responsible to pick up the corresponding factories, and it is going to create an object based on the client requirement. So I hope you got a clear understanding in the abstract factory design pattern. Let me go to the coding session for that. Let us achieve the abstract factory design pattern in Java programming. Let me begin with the interfaces, which is going to create an object for the factories. Let me create a package called the interfaces, where all the interfaces will be available inside this package. Let me start by creating the UI interface. Let me name it as a UI interface, and let me define the method here. Public void create UI objects. Similarly, let me create for the backend interface. Backend interface. Let me define the method here. Is public void create backend objects. Now we have created the two different interfaces. Let us create an object that shares this interface. The UI interface is going to shared by the HTML developer object and CSS developer object, and where the backend interface going to shared by the Java developer object and SQL developer object. Let us create all those objects here. So let me first create the HTML developer object, which is going to implement the UI interface here. I'm gonna add the unimplemented method, and let's have some sysout here. Let me name it as a creating a HTML object. Now similarly, let us create the CSS developer object. CSS developer object. Let us implement the UI interface. UI interface. Add unimplemented method here, and add some sysout here. Let me name it as a creating CSS object. And now let us go for the backend. So let me create a Java developer object. Let me implement with a backend interface. Add unimplemented method. Let's have some sysout here. Creating Java object. Okay, and let's have one more object for the backend interface. SQL developer object. Let me implement the backend interface. Add an implemented method. Let's have sysort for that. Creating SQL developer object. Now we have created the interfaces and the related object for that. So let us create a factory for that. So let me create a factory. Let name it as a UI factory, and let me create one more factory, that is a backend factory. Since we are just working on an abstract factory design pattern, the two different factories are going to share this common interface. Let me create the interface here. Interface. Let me name it as a developer interface, and let me define the methods here. Public UI interface, get UI object. It's requesting some params here. We are going to pass the params there, and same for the backend. That is a backend interface. Get backend object. It's going to have some params. Okay. Now we have done with the interfaces. Let us implement into the UI factory and backend factory. I'm going to implement developer interface here. Add unimplemented method. The UI factory is responsible to return back the object for the UI interface from the UI interface, where the backend interface will be the null here. So let me have the switch case here. Switch. So it is going to get the request param. So let's have some case. So if it is since that is a UI, so that can be either be HTML or CSS, right? Let me have some HTML. It's going to return back the HTML developer object. This developer object shares the UI interface, right? Okay. Same for the CSS. It's going to return back the CSS developer object, and by default, it is going to return back the null, right? Similarly, let me implement the in backend in the factory implements. It's going to implement the developer interface. Add an implemented method. In this case, the UI interface will be the null, and we are responsible to return back the object for the backend interface. So let me start with the switch case. So it's requesting some params here. So since it's a backend, we're supposed to pass that is either the Java or SQL. So it's going to have the new Java object. This Java object is shared by the backend interface. Same for the SQL, new SQL developer. By default, we are going to return back a null values, right? So now we have done with the UI factory and a backend factory. Now let us create the super factory, which is responsible to pick up the corresponding factories based on the client request. So let me create a super factory. Super factory. Okay. So let me create a static method here, public, and this method is going to return back the common interface, that is a developer interface here. Developer interface. So it should be a static, right? So let me have some static here. There is a modifier. So let me name it as a get object, and it's also going to request some params here. Let me name it as a params, or you can just name whatever you want. Now let's have some switch case, so which is going to return back the developer interface. Return switch. So it is requesting some params. So let's start the case. So if the client is going to request for the UI changes, it's supposed to call the UI factory. Same for the backend. If the client is planning for do some changes in a backend, it's supposed to return a backend factory. And by default, we are going to return back a null here. Now we have done with the super factory. Now let us create a main class here. Let me name it as a client class, and let me define the public start void main, public static void main. Okay. So now let me create an object for the developer factory. I mean developer interface is equals to, since the super factory is this method is a static, so there is no need to create a object for the super factory by using the new keyword. So I'm going to call the super factory dot get object, So here we are going to pause what kind of the changes that we need to do. So that can be the UI, that can either be the UI or a backend. So let me pass the UI. So this, after pausing here, this method is going to return back the developer object. I mean developer interface. So that's why I'm just naming it as a developer interface, right? So from the developer interface, now it was name. We are going to call the UI factory. So now that from the developer interface, we are going to get the UI object. This UI object is can either be the HTML or CSS. Now from here we are going to create the UI object. Right? Let me run this application. Now creating the HTML object. Same goes for the backend. So let me change with the backend here. And this is a backend. So the object will be the get backend object, and it can either be the Java or a SQL. So it's going to call the method called the create backend object. So let me rerun this application. Now creating the Java object here. Hope you got a clear understanding in abstract factory design pattern. If you like this video, click the like button and don't forget to subscribe to my channel to get more videos like this. Thank you.